So, good morning and welcome to Business Breakthrough in November 22, the 18th of November, on our regular networking meeting. We've got two very, very interesting interviews to have this morning. The first one of which is with Craig Hunter, who is our business in the room for today. Craig, I'd just like to invite you initially to unmute yourself and just introduce yourself and your business and tell us a little bit about who you are, what your business does, but don't give it any away. We'll have some proper questions about that in a minute. Over to you, Craig.
Okay, well, I said hello earlier when I came on. I was John Peck, but I'm not. I'm Craig Hunter, thanks to Jill. Although I will mention that John Peck is part of our organization and he forms an integral part of it. Yeah, my background is pretty much, and job currently is an international marketing function for a business that we've re-engineered. A business that started probably 40 years ago. Part of the functionality of John is very strong in coding, very strong in developing new software models for solving problems, which is what we do. Originally, that was built around about 3,000 modules that had been built over 25 or 30 years in the event space, but never really taken to market, that were just floundering around with specific internal clients that John was using. I came in and re-engineered the business from what was called Abbey Crown, started 40 years ago, to what today is Catalytic Solutions International Limited. We have clients all over the world. We still have not a watered down, but a more focused suite of event management products, but we are in the industry to become a tech partner. So we do a lot of event partnering for event companies, but we've also started to become a tech development or DevOps partner in procurement, actually, Mark, and some commercial areas and prop tech. And we're doing some work for emergency services, Ministry of Defense, and even some of our own products, which are things like workplace well-being, and we've launched a product called Stress Express, for instance, which is a digitized product to manage stress and workplace well-being in both the sport and in the commercial sector. So we're pretty much on an edge of developing new and fresh ideas in industry, both commercially and in the event sector.
So clearly that's not a UK accent I can hear going through.
No,
there.
it's an accent.
Where you're based, where you're personally from, and also where's the business based?
Well, the business is a Wiltshire-based business. I've originally came from Cape Town. My background was originally started in strategy and strategic branding in the advertising industry, but eventually moved into, for my sins, cash management software in the banking and switching sector, and worked actually for G4S in Africa.
Okay, so where are you based now?
But I'm based now here in the UK. I don't live in Wiltshire anymore. I live north of Northampton.
Brilliant.
Mainly because I needed to be a little bit more central between the north and London, because business is stretchy. As we've broken out of COVID, I get stretched a little bit all over the place. So it was better to kind of move a little bit more centrally. So that's what we've done, and which gives me access both north and south, which has been important. Brilliant. Basically, because my job has been over the last 2 or 3 years, I've been here 2.5 years already, is to network as much as possible and come in contact with as many people as possible.
So Catalytic Solutions, and you're very much involved in branding and marketing. You've been across a number of industries and a number of solutions over your career. Catalytic is working very much in the digital world. Just give us a little bit more of an in-depth feel for the kind of, who are your clients, what are the problems you're looking to solve, and what are the solutions you're delivering for them?
Yeah, it was an interesting, I inherited almost the legacy of my partner, John Peck, who started coding, and it's all about coding, and he believes that, if there's code, there's a way. John's a very interesting man. He's 83 years old and he still codes on a daily basis. He's known all over the world. He was building software solutions and systems before Microsoft as we know it existed. So that goes back a way. And things that we work on today, like Airbnb booking systems and booking.com and things, were things that he started long before even Microsoft existed. So he, through the years, started to build platforms for the events industry, slowly and holistically realistically produced probably about 3,000 modules, which he never really took to market. And when I started working with him from Cape Town, because I had some problems in digital journeys and couldn't solve them, we started to get together. And when I got here 2.5 years or so ago, we looked at this monster, which was like chewing your way through an elephant. It had over 3,000 modules in it John had produced, but they were highly effective, amazing things for managing not just events, all kinds of functionality, various interoperable formats. And we took it and distilled it down into something that was usable. We broke it down into what is now 6 modules for the events industry. And but of course, the market, because we have such a strong focus on looking for cutting edge functionality in the digital space, we started to get as a partner, as a development partner, dragged into other spaces like emergency services and the Ministry of Defense and healthcare and things like that, just because we see things in a different way in terms of solving people's problems.
So with COVID having just come along, you know, a lot of the events industry either stopped dead in the water or went online, and I'm guessing, and it is you can tell me I'm right or wrong in a minute, that you saw that event side of the digital options come through. I mean, I come from an event, large public event system myself, and I spent a number of decades working on physical practical solutions. You know, what happens when that thing goes wrong over there, and we've got to sort it out before the next show goes up, and that kind of game. That's obviously got its equivalent in the digital world. So I'm interested to hear the kinds of solutions to the kinds of problems that you're looking at in that digital world. But I also, you alluded there to the fact that you've seen some of that technology and that expertise translate into blue light services and a few other things. So I can sort of see the logic follow through on that, but I'm interested to hear from your end exactly what it was, that inspired you to see that crossover, and then what were those things that you thought, actually, if we can do that with this over here, then why can't we do it over there? So yeah. A couple of complicated questions wrapped into one there. I'll let you unpack it.
No, that's fine. It was progressive. It was, you know, we all arrived and sat around at home, and COVID was all around us, and we had an entire events industry that came, as you know, to a complete stop. I did have the opportunity to, and we were involved in the Lions Springbok tour in South Africa across the 7 precincts in the stadia, which was on and off, and eventually didn't happen, but we were consulting on that with software in terms of access control and management on the precincts. So then we sat back and said, well, what are we going to do for the next year? And we started looking at our own skill sets and saying, well, where are there opportunities? Well, the first opportunity we did was we built a COVID hospitality management system on mobile, which is one that perhaps you guys used. It belonged to NHS or the government. In April already of the first COVID lockdown, I then managed to get hold of Matt Hancock, everybody's friend on TV currently, and gave it to him for free and said, we've built a management system for hospitality that works very well on mobile. We've built the app and everything. And he turned me down. And that was in April. In the September of that year, the government produced whatever that thing was that we used it, if that you went through the hospitality functionality, scanned a QR code. It was messy. The data never belonged to anybody. It got hacked, and all the women were getting phoned from everywhere because somebody broke into the system. But that was the sort of thought process. We then sat back and said, well, okay, he doesn't want that. But the next thing that's going to happen is, when we start coming out of COVID, we're going to start looking at lateral flow tests, and the lateral flow test functionality also was an honor system. You could use your whites if you wanted to get into a concert or a function. You didn't mean nobody could control it. So what we did is we built an AI functionality on a mobile device camera, and we started managing the QR code on lateral flow tests, and we created a COVID passport, which included selfies and a 24-hour digitized passport on your mobile phone, which we were wanting to bring to the market. But it's just brought us into a space where we started realizing that from the AI that we were learning, that this passport functionality could be used in a number of other areas. And then, of course, I got approached by an IT company I tried to put it into perhaps the the prisons and the police and emergency services. And what really happened was an IT company that was already on their procurement list came back to me and said, we have a product that we're wanting to solve, which is what's happening currently is Boris had said at the time he was going to increase the Metropolitan Police Force by 20,000 members because they wanted more policing on the street based on things that had happened. So the Everard functionality and things in the market, you know. And the problem is the courts are sending low-grade offenders home because it's cheaper for the community to look after them than keep them in prison. But we can't manage them because on the street, policing spend 60% of their time chasing offenders that should be in a specific space and they're never there. Can you solve it? So we produced a product called AutoCop, which is called Automatic Confirmation of Presence. What we did was we produced a digitized functionality for the police to manage offenders through an IP and geolocator on an individual onboarding on their phone, along with fingerprinting and a random voice and visual identification platform, which we'd already built from the COVID functionality, into what today will become AutoCop, which is a management function with a triage score out of 6, which then goes to the police's storm incident board, and they can manage offenders digitally, and the police don't have to run around looking after them all the time if they're in their precinct. We thought the precinct would be home-based, but it wasn't, so we had to bring the company What 3 Words, everybody knows that, which allows us to build a precinct. So some people in their curfews are allowed in a village or in a county, or in some cases within 4 blocks of their house. So, you know, they can go down to the pub or the supermarket. So that allowed us to broaden some of the thinking. And we currently now building, right this minute, the parole board has come back to us now and said to us, can you build a management system for parolees? Because it's an overwhelming function that the desk sergeant in a police station or the parole fellow that has to mark them down every day doesn't have the time to process them. So we've created a system where it's a kiosk in council offices, which will be launched in the new year, where a parolee will be brought on board. They will go to the council office, they'll log on, and they will put whatever their identification code is that's been allocated to them through the parole board within the parameters of what the court ruling is, and they will then do a voice and visual identification, and then we can manage and triage them. So the whole thing took us into a whole new world based on actually being bored in the COVID space.
So there's so that's an experience that a lot of people will relate to, and it's an interesting example of pivoting a business, basically. That goes into the whole thing. I'm pivoting a couple of times over from what I pick up there, because obviously you're starting in the events industry, and then the events industry comes to, as you observe, versions in different spaces of grinding halts that we all experienced our way through those couple of years of COVID. And certainly the venues and things, the public-facing pieces, they had a lot of community support and a lot of you know, the brands that people recognised people didn't want to use the brands, but the supply chain sitting just underneath that really did hit a brick wall at 100 miles an hour. So that I can see was a really interesting thing that pivots and says, okay, so how can we keep this industry alive or support the industry by creating some sort of option to happen online, and then pivoting again, as you've alluded to there, going through into other opportunities that you see grow as a result. And we saw a little bit of that ourselves with we have an online version of the show now called Business Insights, which pivoted once to come into existence and then pivoted again when everybody started going busy again and took on a whole new world. But that's something else altogether, which makes it another day. Interesting one though, one that we're seeing as we do all that pivoting and thinking about it. You're moving a lot into the digital space there. That obviously is a space you work in, and a lot of the discussion and thinking that we've found ourselves involved in is that trade-off between digital and human personal relational, and the clear conclusion we get to is that either extreme is not the right thing, because if you land completely in relation and throw out the digital, then you're A, throwing out a lot of opportunity, and B, obviously, you know, a lot of the future is going into digital. But there's also a lot of danger in going all the way into digital, because human relationships are part of the human condition, who we all are. And so, you know, we're sat here on a networking call that's happening purely in a digital format, and you know, we can involve people from all over the place. There's opportunity, the geographical boundaries come off. There's so much more you can do. And we've got partners all over the world in what we do now that we didn't even dream of having in March, whatever it is, 2019, 2020. I lose the plot with that one. But it's also a very different thing to meet them in person. So I'm just interested from your perspective, as you've gone through this journey, where do you see the balance sitting between digital interaction for people and human relational interaction?
That's a brilliant question. We're actually wrestling with it right now. The events industry as a whole, because although we've morphed perhaps and changed a little bit because of our skill sets, we haven't lost the fact that and John always says this to me, why are we still building stuff when we can go back into the industry where we've got stuff we don't have to build? But we've had some, I don't want to use the word reluctance, but in some cases, the events industry is a massive space. I mean, probably 80 billion pounds a year. There's millions of people that work in it. They all have different ways of doing things and managing the projects they're on. But there's been, and we've tried for the last year to break some of the boundaries where they say, yes, we want to be come into the digital world, but they're all still working on paper-based Excel spreadsheets and things. So there is still a reluctance in that industry to step across that divide. And we've said, well, we understand that. So the best way of doing that, and we're looking at our business, is not the big engine on the back and how powerful it is with the database and InterSystems that drives it, but to come back to the front of the digital process and try and create user interfaces that are more personalized, maybe is the best way of doing it, a lot easier, swipe left, swipe right, make things very simple for people to use so that that transformation into what would become a digital space is easier for them. But at the same time, we've recognized that, you know, we have to try and strike a balance between what people want to do and what we think they should be doing. And I have this fight all the time with our DevOps teams all over the world. The developers build functionality that's so functional, you know, but it's the way their brains sit, it's not really. And we've managed that balance because I always ask them, how would the customer work on this project? How do they interface with it? How do they feel about what you've put on this mobile device that works for them? You know, so we wrestle all the time. I don't think it's a solvable problem, but we try and find a balance, which is absolutely correct, because you can't be everything to everybody digitally.
No, and I think the observations I get to this, and it's a work in progress. You're absolutely right.
Yes.
But, one of the things we've really come to realise and come to appreciate as we've been pushing together, emotional intelligence as a concept area is a really interesting space. Basically, the science a little bit of why people do what they do, and you know, our deeper dive, and it started in cyber and it's moved to a lot of other spaces, and basically there's always a really interesting understanding in emotional intelligence of why people respond to things the way they do and how they operate.
Yes.
So there's an interesting take on anything we do, and the whole digital relational balance is a key part of that. But the other thing that I would observe as well, and if I go back to years of spent for managing festival sites, technical operations and things, long before digital really came into play. The example I use every now and again is I was with a lighting designer at a trade show at one point, and I came originally from the world of lighting design, and you know, it's very interesting to think about what that moving fixture is, or that desk, or how the DMX coding happens that makes it all go, and you get very excited about that as a specialist in the space. And I got to a point where I was managing an entire event site, and we had like 80 performance spaces. And I had a client I had to keep happy, and I had a knowledge enough of it to manage it and run it, but we were working with others who were doing the job I would have been doing. And I was at a trade show, and we were looking at this brand new whizzy thingy moving head that was the latest thing since sliced bread. And you know, we got talking, and he was really getting excited about this thing. And I just found myself saying, look, bottom line here, is it going to do what we want it to do? Is it going to do it on budget? Are the punters going to like it? And is everyone going to be happy? Yeah, they're going to be. That's fine. That's really, at this stage, is all we need to know. And actually, for me, that was a really interesting shift in my own head between getting totally excited about a technical concept, which is an important thing to do for those who are involved, versus actually getting an understanding of how the client and the public and what you're trying to do is looking at that. And sometimes the technical developers in this context get so focused on digital detail that they lose the point of what they're doing. And the management of that is about keeping that balance in place. And it does play right back into that relational digital world that we live in.
In fact, I've gone full circle back to my branding and strategic corporate branding functionality I had 30 years ago, where we're starting to go to the product and look at what we, also because we now, as much as we are a tech partner to organizations, we also got one or two products that we've launched. So we've gone back to the strategy of saying, well, what are we going to do with this? How's the end user going to relate to this, rather than us thinking that it's this amazing thing that's going to happen? Specifically, we've got a product we're launching called Stress Express, which of course is a corporate wellness, workplace well-being product. And we thought, well, we got feedback from Mind to say we can digitize this process because we need an element of anonymity for the individual and their information based on their mental well-being, because we got a lot of feedback also that said the mental health concept around this is a difficult word for people, and they're a little, people, it's personal. So how do we make this work? So we went back into the marketplaces and we had all this voice analytics and visual and your facial measurements of you under stress. And we said, well, hold on, we need to look at things a little differently. So we brought some psychometric scientists into the space, and we built lifestyle questionnaires and functionality around psychometrics too, so that it became something that was more, I don't want to use the word homespun because it is a piece of science, but it was something a lot more genuine than just us being smart about our artificial intelligence and machine learning. And the product became a lot more wholesome and a lot more meaningful. It was specifically going back and saying, how would our market react to us asking them questions about their state of mind?
So it sounds like you've got an interesting future ahead of you. And brilliant. Thank you. Really interesting to hear a little bit of an in-depth thing there about some.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. We love problems. Give us a problem, we'll go away and find an architecture, but we'll always ask everybody, what do you want from this? How do you want it to deliver? We've realized that the tech can't solve everything, as much as John thinks it can. Where there's code, there's a way. He'll solve it.
Yeah. And it's a support exercise. Brilliant. Thank you. And we'll have an opportunity a little bit later just to lob some questions around. So if anybody actually wants to interrogate Craig, well, do make contact with him in the chat box.
But, I'm there. Yeah. Thank you.
But yes, very interesting. I want to introduce another player now, Mike Cameron-Davies. So again, our apologies that Mike is not Jane and Jane is not Mike, and I'm sure Jane would cope with that. Mike's got an interesting pair of feet, one in the corporate sector and one in the micro and SME. So he wondered where I was going with that for a minute there, didn't he? I certainly not. One in the corporate sector and one in the micro and SME sector. And that gives him a really interesting insight into some of the stuff that we're going to talk about now. Most of us, he said, just quickly glancing down the screen, if not all of us, are involved in that micro and SME sector space. And we all look at supply chains, and actually whether we're part of a supply chain that is just me and the guy down the road who I do a lot of work for, or whether I'm part of a supply chain which actually is part of a bigger supply chain that ultimately ends up producing widgets that go in very big concept products in aerospace or something. They're still supply chains. And if we look at it from the perspective of the buyers, there's an awful lot of money gets spent with supply chains, and there's a procurement itself is a piece of magic which some people love and some people hate. And then actually, if you take that procurement and you think about it in terms of social value, it's got a whole different take on it. So, Mike, I'm going to ask you to sort of just do a couple of things to begin with. First, introduce yourself and what you actually do on a bit more an in-depth level in this space of buying and selling in the corporate sector. But then just give us a little bit of an overview of the procurement system at a starting point that you see it. Procurement can be a very dry subject. We can change that a little bit, but obviously we need to understand it before we kick in. So Mike, over to you for a bit of an introduction.
Yeah, sure, no problem. I'll do the introduction by way of the discussion about procurement. Probably is the easiest way. So most of my career I've been in large corporates, lots of big brand names that people know. So Ford Motor Company, Honeywell, Avon Rubber, Amy PLC, all sorts of companies like that. But whatever role I've done, I've always kind of been a change agent. So I've had all sorts of job titles, but whenever I got into the job, it was kind of, yeah, well, we need you to do that, but actually what we really need to do, and the role involved doing lots of different stuff, which meant I've played in lots of fields in those big corporates, and quite often got involved in procurement in many different kind of ways. A couple of years ago, I set up my own consultancy, and my objective of my consultancy is supporting smaller to medium local businesses with tools, knowledge, experience that, to be honest, they just can't access because the big guys have spent so much money on these kind of things. So it really kind of knowledge sharing, helping, all that kind of thing. And of course, my knowledge and experience of procurement in the big guys not only helps me, but it's stuff that I can share with them. And just to give one example, I mean, I work for myself. I'm on a framework at the moment with Network Rail, which, you know, anyone who knows companies like that know it's a nightmare to get into their systems, to get, you know, anywhere close to them. But I think what the corporate world taught me was how those guys operate, and therefore how to navigate through their systems and find ways through. So if I move on to the bit about my understanding of supply chain, so 35 years with big corporates, I've seen a lot, but I've seen a lot of the same very much in the corporates. And it's interesting that the cycle of the economy that we're in at the moment, where, you know, everyone's using the R word as a belief that all the companies are going to hunker down and start saving money and all that kind of stuff. And you know, it's a 4 to 8 year cycle. The recession, we see it all the time. Those of us with grey hair like me have seen quite a few. Those without have maybe only seen one or two. And the big corporates are very much driven by numbers, no great surprise. And when things get tight, there is a standard routine of the big corporates will go and try and reduce the numbers of suppliers in their supply chain. And it's a very simple equation, because the more suppliers you've got, the more management you've got of those suppliers, therefore the more overhead you've got in your business to manage those suppliers. And it's a very straightforward, simple cost reduction process. It's the corporate, or one of the corporate equivalents of cutting the pencil in half, and then you've got 2 pencils. So from a corporate perspective, that is very often one of their big drivers, is reduce the number of suppliers, therefore I have less people to manage, therefore it costs me less overhead. The flip of that coin is, the reality when they do that is a lot of the bigger suppliers then just pass through what the smaller suppliers are doing with a markup on it. So it ends up costing you money. The more intelligent bigger companies understand this and work slightly different. So what I'm describing is kind of, I guess, a generic model. And so within that, if we flip that round to the other side of it, because whilst in the big corporates, I did work a lot with the small guys to understand their challenges and all that kind of stuff, because sometimes I did identify great small companies I wanted to work with, but they couldn't get on the big company frameworks. The other side of that is how difficult it is for the small guys to even start the game. You know, how do I even get through to the big guy? You know, I don't even know who to talk to. I can send 100 emails, they'll all get blocked. Occasionally I'll see a framework that I try and get onto, and it's like this massive paperwork, and again, I don't even know where to start, and even if I do, is the investment ever going to pay off, and all those kind of things. So I think hopefully that's a simple enough explanation, but that's my 30-odd year view of what I've seen from both ends.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we all can relate to that to some degree, and it boils down from the micro and SME side that says, you know, you said that there is this investment going to pay off. You know, we're all trying to do business where you've got a one-man operating business. Any time you spend on overhead, especially when it's overhead you fundamentally don't enjoy doing. You know, most people are operationally focused. If your business is around delivering something, then it's there probably because you enjoy doing that. So why would you spend the time going through the bureaucratic overheads at risk of not getting anywhere with it, spend hours and hours and hours doing something you don't enjoy in order to not be able to penetrate, as you say, a big framework? So that's a really good point, and it's something which I think my observation would be the corporates and the buyers, the sellers, the guys doing the buying, understand, but don't necessarily understand how to engage. But they are increasingly seeing it as a problem because of the whole social value game that's coming in now. Social value for we understand, those of us who've been looking at things like the Social Value Act, which is a statutory set of legislation that was brought in 2012, but is constantly being amended and growing and becoming clearer and firmer, that says certainly in local government spending, there is an increasing requirement for local authorities and central government to account significantly for social value in their buying process. So what are we actually putting back into society, whether that's local, whether it's wages or benefits, how is it benefiting the society around me? That's statutorily laid down for local authority spending, and it hasn't been in the private sector. But as we go through climate change, as we've come through the pandemic, as mental health issues, many things, also problems with the high street and communities, and actually who's paying for what comes into play, many of the private sector businesses are beginning to really understand that this is important. It's becoming more clearly laid down in legislative game that is strengthening, and there is a concern amongst those buyers that they're going to run out of supply chain where the social value issues are higher. So procurement process becomes a really crucial tool in social value. Mike, we've got a thing going on in Gloucestershire called Together Gloucestershire, which is the start point for that. It all started a year or so ago, and some very significant businesses in Gloucestershire started waking up and smelling the coffee and investing in social value at the private sector end. Do you want to give us a little bit of an overview of what's going on in Gloucestershire? Obviously, it's in the world of procurement, but it's beginning to take procurement into a whole different space. What's your shout on that?
So yeah, before I zoom into Gloucestershire, I'm going to kind of zoom out a little bit, I guess, and look at the macro scale, because COVID was a horrible thing for many people. But out of all bad always comes good, I guess. And one of the things that it drove, as we're all stuck at home and couldn't go very far, was kind of a localization agenda. And I think what a lot of people have come to do is appreciate local a lot more, both on a personal and a business level. It really challenged supply chains, because even as the world opened up, it was getting harder and harder. So I think, with that realization for a lot of people, coupled, as Peter said, with the Social Value Act, which is legislating that the public sector procures locally. In the private sector, I think there's the same thoughts, and in fact, the UN's now got a strategy together that they're looking to sign up the big private sector organisations to. That's all about ESG, and ultimately that then also brings with it localisation in procurement. So I think there's a lot of stuff stacking up now that says buying locally is a great thing, and certainly with the companies that I'm talking to, shortening of supply chains as much as possible is becoming really big in their strategy, to the point where there's a lot of people reaching out trying to understand what is local, because that's often the first question. People are just so used to buying on a global scale. And I was at a networking event last week where one of the guys' strap lines is, where do you hide a dead body on page 6 of Google, because no one ever goes there. And of course, Google's driven by more economics. The more money you've got, the more likely you are to be on the front page. And it drives you to buy from the big guys. What that means is if you're actually trying to find a small guy, it's really hard. So people don't even know what's about. So I think there's a really big change going on at the moment. And just to put the public sector one in perspective, I think this is I think the figures are really important. As it stands right now, 10% of the selection criteria on the public sector are to do with localization of the business that they're procuring from. The range currently is 10 to 30. From what I understand, most of the local government organisations are working on 10 at the moment, but there are some already at 30, and the objective is to take it to to 30% of the selection criteria. So whilst the economics, the importance of economics and referenceability and all that kind of stuff is obviously always going to be important, increasingly localization is becoming much more significant.
Okay, so we've got some of the private sector businesses in Gloucestershire starting, well, not just in Gloucestershire, the private sector, two notably that we've been talking about recently, Renishaw and Atkins Global, both of whom have now started investing serious capital in driving social value procurement. It has if you drive procurement to be kept local, and we found locally procurement is an interesting discussion because obviously together Gloucestershire, the pleasing the title, we've been doing a work in Gloucestershire, but in the case of Renishaw, they're right on the bottom edge of Gloucestershire, so it's more tough for them to procure stuff from North Gloucestershire than it is from South, from the north of Gloucester than it is from just over the border in South Gloucestershire as a county. But nonetheless, they are investing in their local communities via their standardized procurement system. But we're encountering, those bigger companies are encountering some headwinds in terms of how to get that change process through. How do you see those headwinds? How do you see them forming? And actually, with the micro SMEs involved, how do you see them engaging with changing the direction of those headwinds?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one, and I guess my earlier career experience kind of plays out in the Together Gloucestershire programme, in that the big corporates really don't know what's about around them. There's a real communication challenge in there, and the small and actually think it's relatively easy for a smaller guy to do business with them, which is often incorrect. And similarly from the small guys, it's not knowing how to tap into those businesses and work with them, plus also not being aware of some of the easy opportunities. So again, quite often when you try and do business with a big company to get in more, so there's all sorts of legislative or corporate type requirements. Have you got ISO 9001? Have you got an anti-slavery policy? Have you got ISO 14001, or otherwise prove that you're an environmentally friendly? All these kind of things that they're great, but they can be barriers as a small business because you might not be as advanced as they like. So I think in the Together Gloucestershire programme, where we're putting some of those big companies together with the small businesses, there's a lot of communications to knock down some of those barriers and dispel some of the myths. For the small businesses, it's helping them understand where the easy wins are. Should a small business be trying to win a multi-million-pound contract, or do they get in there with a small 10,000, £20,000 contract that just helps grow that relationship, understands the client processes, builds a level of trust and all that kind of stuff? And I think it always comes back to people do business with people, and the whites of the eyes, and knowing what people's hobbies and all that kind of stuff just helps that whole thing grow and helps smooth the way. And ultimately that's how the businesses grow. And then the localization thing, what does local mean? Well, if most of your suppliers are in China, if you can just buy stuff or products or services in the UK instead of China, then that's getting local. And so I think, again, it's one of those myth things. The local requirement, normally from the buyer's perspective, needs to be defined by them. Some companies they want to buy within a 5-mile radius. Another company, if they're buying within 50 miles, that's a huge success and a move forward.
So there are two examples that have struck me recently in the various discussions we involved in, one from the buyer's perspective, one from the seller's perspective, which I'm just interested in your insights on. From the buyer's perspective, there was a discussion we were involved in a little while ago with someone who has the overview of procurement and has a procurement organisation working with them, and saying, look, if the thing I want to buy, if the specifier behind me has said that needs yellow knobs, and the one that's available in Gloucestershire or local to me has got blue knobs, then because the specifier has written it's got to have yellow or red knobs, I've got to buy the one in China, where I can't buy the one in Gloucestershire. So the real question has to go upstream from the procurement people to the specifiers. Is it really important what colour the knobs are? And actually, could we do something about the colour of the knobs? so that we could change it so we could buy the Gloucestershire version. And for the sake of a relatively simple discussion, a lot of energy can be redirected very efficiently. So that's one of the challenges that the buyers have. But on the seller's side, we come at it from micro and SME, and we go back a little bit. We were saying a little bit earlier about one-man businesses having to spend time doing things that they're focused on. If, as a part of the social value benefits, you've got the requirement to have an anti-slavery policy built into your system. I won't actually ask people to say it here, but on this screen, how many of us have actually got a proper, in-depth, thought-through, robust anti-slavery system? And what does that actually mean anyway? When we buy from Amazon, the printer that's going to go on the end of our computer because we broke the printer last week, what do we know about the origin of that? And do we have can I say that printer, supports an anti-slavery policy? So two things there, one from the buyer's perspective, one from the seller's perspective. And I'm just, Mike, very briefly, just take each of those and you sit across those two bits of discussion. What's your feel between those?
Yeah, I mean, the first one regarding the buyers is very much a myth-busting requirement, I think, in that, again, from the corporate world, the corporate procurement community normally like the specifier to specify the nth degree out of something so that they've got a nice spec they can work to, and they can lay it across a platform and get everyone to compete equally, and then beat them all up on price because they're saying, oh, you're offering me the same thing but he's 10 quid cheapest, and all that kind of stuff. But actually, having been the specifier myself, it's quite often not like that. I'd much rather give a fairly vague requirement out and see what comes back, and then work from that kind of thing. So there's kind of a real conflict in the big organizations there. And again, it's where that people do business with people, is if you're a small business and you can talk to the specifier and you can have that conversation, and whether it's right or wrong, it happens. I know where the small local company will have the conversation with the specifier, and the specifier specifies it exactly the opposite to the way you said then, Pete, that the only person that can procure it now is the small local guy. It's worked the other way around. So I'm not saying that that's right or wrong, but there is a lot of stuff in there that needs to be worked through to change that dynamic, and it is about communications, and it is about changing the way the big guys operate with regards to that. Sorry, go on, Pete.
No, I was just going to say that, and the micro, the whole thing about, do I need an anti-slavery policy in my tiny little business that I run in my spare time? Not quite. I'm never doing it there.
Yeah, so that's a good one. I think a lot of work needs to be done with the big guys around that, because it's very easy to try and de-risk everything and tar everyone with the same brush. So I don't think to address that issue is one action. I think there's a suite of actions. However, from the small guy perspective, again, having experience it myself, I just picked up a pretty big contract with a really big guy who day one sends me all this paperwork they want me to fill out and prove all this stuff. And the first thing I said was, here's what I have got, but I haven't got all of this. Do you really need it? And by the way, this is why I don't think you need it. And lo and behold, it immediately came back and said, no, we don't need all that. Not for what you're doing. So sometimes just asking the question helps. But similarly, as a small guy, a lot of that stuff is really easy to get. And people like the FSB, they have blank templates. So anti-slavery policy, great. Take the template off the FSB or whoever else. Put your company name on it, put your company header on it, do it. It's another box ticked. It means that when you have the conversation with the big guy, instead of saying, look, there's 20 things I haven't got out of the 25, you might be having a conversation that says, there's 5 things I haven't got out of the 25. And actually, are they really that important for this project? So there's ways and means, but ultimately the big guys, it's a lot of work, I think, to be done by the big guys to understand that if they really want to do business locally, and my experience in talking to the ones in Together Gloucestershire, which some pretty big names, several FTSE 100 companies, talking to those guys is, yes, we really do, then they've got to realise that they've got to simplify some things down if they really want to work with the small guys, and take away some of those barriers, and yet maybe put a bit more risk into their procurement process. But it's a whole equation. There's a risk-reward balance in there.
Brilliant, Mike. That's been a really interesting insight, and thank you for that.
You're welcome.
If people, just very quickly, if people want to get involved in this discussion? I do mean the discussion, but actually in rolling it out in the actions and the outcomes and effectiveness. How do they do that?
So it's lovely that Jill's on the on the call, because Jill's chairing Together Gloucestershire for us. At the moment, as Pete said, we've been running it for about a year. We've got 2 forums running: a large corporate and public sector, an MSME forum. And up till now, we've kind of kept those 2 things distinct, because we didn't kind of want to pollute where the 2 are coming from. We wanted to probably understand where the MSMEs are, probably understand where the corps are, and then start bringing it all together. And we're just at that stage. So if you wanted to join, you want to be a part of it, even just get the information, or the other end of the spectrum, if you want to be really active and start helping undertake some stuff, please contact Jill, who will put you on the mailing list, and you can choose to engage as much or as little as you like.
Brilliant, thank you.